Today, we're talking about witches. The fascination with them has persisted for centuries, feared, revered, and misunderstood. From ancient pagan rituals to the horrors of the witch trials, witches have symbolized everything from ultimate power to ultimate evil. But how did we go from witches being burned at the stake to seeing them as complex, relatable characters in modern media?
In the video today, we're going to explore the historical background of witchcraft and witches, how witches have been portrayed across media, and how their depictions have evolved in both fantasy and horror. We're going to explore everything from early folklore to modern interpretations, and analyze how these depictions reflect the cultural fears and desires of their time. Where does humanity's fascination with witchcraft, the good and the bad, comes from? So let's get to it.
Witchcraft has roots in ancient civilizations. In Babylonian, Greek, and Celtic cultures, magic and spells were part of everyday life. Witches were seen as wise healers, protectors, or intermediaries between the human and the divine. But things began to shift as pagan rituals came into conflict with the rising influence of organized religion. Practices once seen as sacred became suspicious, eventually giving rise to the fear of witches as dangerous, malevolent figures.
One of the darkest periods in history was the witch hunts in Europe and colonial America. European witch trials of the 15th and 16th centuries saw tens of thousands of people, mostly women, accused of witchcraft and executed. The Salem witch trials of 1692 in Massachusetts remain one of the most infamous examples of how paranoia and fear can spiral out of control. These hunts were fueled by misogyny, of course, fear of the unknown, and a desire to control people who doesn't really fit the social norm. Figures like Joan of Arc, labeled a witch for her defiance and power, stand as a tragic example of how the witch label was used for rebels, outsiders, and just powerful women in general to try to control and punish them. It's hard to talk about witchcraft without addressing the huge misogynistic history.
The witch hunts of Europe were driven by a mix of superstition, religious fervor, and social control, leading to countless tragic stories. Accusations of witchcraft were often based on the flimsiest of reasons: an argument with a neighbor, the sudden death of livestock, or even a storm destroying crops could be enough to brand someone a witch. Women who were independent, unmarried, or simply different were frequently targeted. One infamous case involved a woman accused of witchcraft for baking bread that allegedly caused a man to fall ill. Others were condemned for having birthmarks or moles, which were believed to be devil's marks. The criteria for identifying witches became increasingly absurd, with accusations ranging from flying on broomsticks to summoning storms. In some cases, entire towns descended into paranoia, with neighbor turning against neighbor. The Salem witch trials are perhaps the most well-known example, where teenage girls claimed to be possessed and accused dozens of innocent people of witchcraft, resulting in 20 executions. In Europe, the madness reached even greater extremes. In Würzburg, Germany, over 900 people were executed in a single witch trial. Trials were brutal and often involved torture to extract confessions. Suspected witches were subjected to horrific ordeals like the swimming test, where they were thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned anyway. The sheer cruelty and irrationality of these hunts left a deep scar on history and influenced how witches would be portrayed in fiction for centuries to come.
Today, witchcraft has undergone a remarkable transformation, shedding a lot of its dark historical stigma and evolving into a symbol of empowerment and self-expression. Modern witchcraft is often associated with spirituality, personal growth, and a connection to nature. So practices like tarot reading, herbalism, and crystal healing have gained popularity, particularly among these seeking alternative forms of wellness and guidance. Social media, of course, has played a huge role with this. There's witch talk and just other types of online communities, turning witchcraft into a lifestyle movement. For many, the modern witch represents rebellion against social norms and patriarchal structures. Basically, a reclamation of the power that was once used to marginalize and control. Now let's move on to fiction then and take a look at how witches have been depicted over history.
Early depictions of witches in fiction leaned heavily into fear and villainy, reflecting cultural anxieties and superstitions of the time. One of the most iconic examples is the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz. With her green skin, pointed hat, and sinister cackle, she became the blueprint for how witches were visualized in popular culture for decades. She embodies pure evil, driven by jealousy and a thirst for revenge, wielding dark magic to terrorize the innocent. Fairy tales reinforce this archetype with stories like Hansel and Gretel. They served as cautionary figures, warning children and adults alike to avoid straying from the safety of societal norms. As horror and fantasy evolved, witches took on a more seductive and dangerous allure, merging with the Gothic tradition to become symbols of forbidden power and dark beauty. In these stories, witches were no longer just old hags, but femme fatales, powerful, secretive, and often deadly. Films like Suspiria elevated this imagery, portraying witches as part of a secret, malevolent coven operating beneath the surface of society. The witches in Suspiria are not only dangerous but deeply tied to occultism and supernatural horror. But in more recent decades, witches have been reclaimed and reimagined as complex, often misunderstood figures. No longer simply villains or seductresses, they've become symbols of empowerment, resistance, and personal transformation. Films like Practical Magic offer a heartwarming portrayal, focusing on two sisters who embrace their magical heritage while struggling to fit into a world that fears and misunderstands them. The Craft presents witches as teenage outsiders discovering their power in response to bullying and alienation. It explores identity, friendship, and the dangers of wielding power without accountability, resonating with a generation looking for stories of rebellion and belonging. In the last 10 to 15 years, pop culture has helped reframe witches as symbols of empowerment rather than fear. TV shows like American Horror Story, Coven, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina showcase witches as powerful, complex figures.
Meanwhile, the rise of witch talk on TikTok has brought witchcraft to mainstream culture. Users, they share everything from spell tutorials to discussions of energy cleansing and astrology. Even brands, of course, have capitalized on the trend. Witchcraft-inspired fashion, beauty products, and home decor are everywhere. So what was once an underground movement has become a visible and thriving subculture. And it gives people a way to explore their individuality, seek balance, and, just find their own little niche.
On the darker end of the spectrum, The Witch, 2015, stands out for blending psychological horror with historical accuracy. Set in the 1630s New England, it tells the story of a Puritan family isolated from society and unraveling under the weight of religious paranoia and supernatural forces. The film's depiction of witchcraft is terrifying, but it also serves as a commentary on repression and societal control. The protagonist, Thomasin, starts as a powerless girl blamed for the family's misfortune, but by the end, she finds liberation in embracing the very thing that had been used to oppress her, witchcraft. The witch takes the archetype of the evil witch and subverts it, turning it into a symbol of autonomy and freedom from oppressive forces.
This evolution is what makes witches such fascinating figures in fiction. They were once depicted as terrifying villains, to seductive femme fatales, to misunderstood outsiders, and symbols of empowerment. The witches pretty much have adapted to reflect the fears and desires of each era. Sometimes they are cautionary tales, sometimes they're just forces of rebellion. Their presence always carries weight and meaning. I would say the overall perception is they represent the struggle for power to preserve their position from outsiders. They're a lot about identity as well, of course, and they're also a lot about freedom.
Over time, the meaning of witches in media has evolved, but certain themes remain central to their depiction in fiction. Let's break down some of the most prominent themes tied to witchcraft in fantasy and horror. Witches have long been symbols of female empowerment and rebellion against patriarchal systems. Historically, the women accused of witchcraft were often those who defied traditional roles, midwives, healers, or simply outspoken individuals. Their magic, both literal and symbolic, became a stand-in for autonomy and strength in the face of oppressive structures. Stories about witches are often tales of self-discovery and breaking free from control. Films like The Craft and shows like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina tap into this, showing young women gaining power as they challenge the systems that hold them back. Witches have also served as enduring metaphors for societal anxieties, often becoming scapegoats for society's problems. Historically, they were blamed for natural disasters, plagues, and misfortunes that couldn't be easily explained. This fear of witches was rooted in a broader fear of the unknown, of outsiders who didn't conform to societal norms. Horror films like The Witch and Suspiria lean heavily into this theme, using witches as agents of chaos and destruction, while at the same time exploring society's fear of independent women and alternative worldviews. Witches are deeply connected to nature, often portrayed as mediators between the human world and the natural one. They draw their power from the earth, plants, animals, the moon, and the elements. This connection can be both nurturing and destructive, reflecting nature's dual role as a source of life and a force of chaos. This theme is especially prominent in folk horror, where witches are often depicted as a part of the ancient, primal forces of nature, punishing those who disrupt the natural balance. Witchcraft is often associated with breaking boundaries, social, moral, and physical. Witches represent transgression and freedom from restrictive societal rules. This transgressive nature often ties into themes of sexuality, power, and the desire to explore what society labels as forbidden.
That's what makes witches such rich symbols of fiction. These themes of maintenance of power, rebellion, fear of the unknown, connection to nature, they are pretty much deep aspects of the human experience. So the witch stories allow writers to explore complex ideas in a way that feel both ancient and timeless. The modern interpretations bring a fresh twist to it. A big thing for witches for me is how you can portray their magic as eerie, as something awe-inspiring and scary. So this is what we're going to talk about next. How do we see witchcraft as a magic system in a fantasy context?
In some stories, witchcraft is treated as a highly structured, organized system of magic, with clear rules, spells, and limitations. The Harry Potter series is an example of this approach. Magic is institutionalized through schools like Hogwarts, where witches and wizards learn specific spells, potions, and magical theory. This structured magic system provides a sense of order and predictability, turning witchcraft into something akin to science with its own laws and mechanics. Even though J.K. Rowling is not the best at making the system feel consistent throughout the series. On the opposite end of the spectrum, some stories portray witchcraft as an ancient, primal force, wild, unknowable, and deeply unsettling. Films like The Witch or Suspiria lean into this depiction, presenting witchcraft as something terrifying and awe-inspiring. In these stories, magic defies explanation, operating on instinct and ritual rather than structured rules. Its power feels vast and untamed, drawing on ancient energies beyond human comprehension. This type of witchcraft creates an atmosphere of dread and reverence, where each spell or ritual is less about control and more about surrendering to something greater. Witches have always been powerful symbols, evolving with each generation to reflect our changing fears, desires, and cultural struggles. From ancient healers to fearsome villains, seductive femme fatale, and modern symbols of empowerment, they continue to captivate our imaginations. Whether portrayed as terrifying forces of nature or misunderstood outsiders, witches allow us to explore deep, universal themes while challenging the boundaries of storytelling. Their complexity and adaptability ensure they'll remain central figures in fiction for many years to come.
So, what do you think? Why do witches continue to have such a strong place in fiction and culture? Do you prefer the structured magic systems surrounding witchcraft? Or are you more drawn to the wild, mysterious, and unpredictable dark forces behind it? Let me know in the comments. As usual, if you like discussing fantasy and world building, feel free to join our free Discord server. It's called Loregeist Tavern. You can find the link in the channels page. Thanks for watching so far, and see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.